You're saying that humans need fantasies to make life bearable?
No. Humans need fantasy to be human. To be the place where the falling angel meets the rising ape.
With tooth fairies, hogfathers.
Yes. As practice, you have to start out learning to believe the little lies.
So we can believe the big ones?
Yes. Justice, mercy, duty, that sort of thing.
They're not the same at all.
You think so? Then take the universe and grind it down to the finest powder and sieve it through the finest sieve, and then show me one atom of justice, one molecule of mercy. And yet, you try to act as if there is some ideal order in the world, as if there is some rightness in the universe by which it may be judged.
But people have got to believe that. What's the point?
You need to believe in things that aren't true. How else can they become?
Heresy shouldn't be this much fun, oh my beloved truth seekers. After all, the word heresy comes from the Greek to make a choice, although it evolved in Christian times to the context of any individual choice that went against orthodoxy. I do like versions others have conjured on the meaning of heresy, like Robert Ingersoll, who said a heretic is, quote, the man who is ahead, or Gotthold Hessing, who said, quote, a heretic is any man who sees with his own eyes, as well as Graham Greene, who said, quote, heresy is another word for freedom of thought. Or perhaps a more humorous one by William Brand, who said heresy is, quote, a fellow who disagrees with you regarding something neither of you knows anything about.
I love humans. All the same patterns and things that aren't there.
But regardless, heresy at its more refined and revolutionary levels is what we do here at Aeon by Gnostic Radio every week. And every week it's broadcast from the virtual Alexandria. This is a perpetual sanctuary that presents you choice after choice beyond the spiritual lobotomies of literalism, in the pleromic wavelength Gnostic spirit, and the rainbow in the dark that is magic and esoterica. Choice to find your own path into an acquaintance with the transcendent and your own transcendental self.
Isn't it? Who am I? Who are you? What other questions are there? What other questions are there, really? If you want to understand the universe, embrace the universe, the door to the universe is you.
Me?
You? Me?
You are really intense.
I, your humble servant and host, Miguel Connor, rarely calls himself a Gnostic. The Gnostics lost to the victors writing corrupt history. There is no unbroken lineage. I'm not planning on marrying a Mandean or Yazidi anytime soon. So I mostly call myself a heretic in public because I want to leverage and weaponize choice until I have so much doggone freedom. And I'll always be an outcast, just like many of you. Choice is more important than ever if we are to continue the revolution in the name of Hypatia of Alexandria to heal the world, the Tikkun Olam, or the gathering of the sparks as they call it in the Kabbalah. One of the most important goals of Gnosticism is an individual sense of wholeness, a balancing of all dualities within our beings, not just with Taoist satisfaction, but for towering these harmonized dualities beyond the physical spheres and experience that knowledge of the unknown. That feeling that is not a feeling, but far more ecstatic and sublime than any human feeling able to be expressed. So welcome to heresy, and welcome to writing your own gospel and living your own myth. Welcome to the machine, my son, and the means to escape it. Thanks for being here.
If we have souls, they are made of the love we share, undimmed by time, unbound by death.
We certainly are very happy to welcome back to the virtual Alexandria, Laurence Caruana, an incredible artist and great advocate of the Gnostics. His novel, The Hidden Passion, is perhaps the best fiction dealing with ancient Gnosticism, right up there with Kai Longfellow's The Secret Magdalene. Laurence is also a singular independent scholar of esoteric systems. We need more crazy diamonds like him in these dark days of mere being.
No matter what anybody tells you, words and ideas can change the world.
In this Eternal Now, Laurence will be discussing his latest book, Sacred Codes. The work is a tome on visionary art and visionary seeing, tapping into the power of imagination, and a comprehensive study of how Western esoteric movements employed sacred geometry, holy symbolism, and ecstatic flights of the soul. It's a damn fine cup of Gnosis, as you will see in our interview. And of course, Laurence will detail how the Gnostics were some of history's chief poets and artists, not just anarchic mystics who threw occult shit on the wall to see what stuck. They drew from the imaginal and the wisdom of the ages. With Laurence insights, you'll be creating better than the creator gods in no time at all. Finding your inner Orpheus in both intuitive and artisan ways. So much choice for that liberation, as I said in the beginning.
Your own father said that artists use lies to tell the truth.
I'd say the main thrust of Gnosis is freedom from all material and psychic bondage. Going to heaven isn't exactly freedom or results in free will. And both reincarnation and extinction just suck Gorgon eggs. As Eric Davis wrote in Nomad Codes, the Neoplatonists ascend through the spheres, the Gnostic sudden awakening, the desert monk's rejection of the Elan Vital, is not simply a philosophical error or the mark of patriarchy, but is fired by an intensely lucid yearning of the highest of goals, liberation.
A world without rules and controls, without borders or boundaries. A world where anything is possible.
In that sense, Gnosis does share with Eastern faiths, as they try to break the manacles of fate and flesh. The difference is that, and that is why Rupert Sheldrake left Hinduism and returned to Christianity, Eastern faiths tend to be completely about personal enlightenment. Sheldrake calls them selfish, while the Gnostics embrace the communal aspects of Judaism and Christianity. You'll never hear of a historical Gnostic in a cave or at the top of a mountain finding Gnosis. They were on the ground with other people. Gnosis tells you that you're only as free as the least of your brothers. The message of Sophia is clear in Gnostic texts. We either all get out or none of us get out. She wants all of her sparks back to her. Sure, not all Gnostics were universalists, but it's a good attitude to embrace when going to spiritual battle. Or if you want to start a work of art like Laurence.
One day, somebody's going to have to make a stand. One day, somebody's going to have to say enough.
Moreover, I think the Gnostics' job is to express their divine spark as best as they can, whether it's producing wonder or leading by example. Like I keep saying, we must create better than those who created our reality. The Gnostic goal is that complete freedom, which means becoming full of potential, which to me is the pleroma, the ground of being or harmonic creativity. Everything else is a footnote after that, certainly in linear time.
What we do in life echoes in eternity.
But enough of my drivel. Led us to the interview with Laurence Caruana on sacred codes. Members will get the complete interview, plus an added bonus. As a companion, I will include our interview with Laurence on his book, Enter Through the Image, which deals with the same themes as sacred codes. But Laurence focuses more on Eastern mysticism and really goes deep into such works as the Gospel of Philip. Yes, heresy shouldn't be this much fun, but it just is. It just bloody is. This is the AM Byte interview, and with us, we definitely have the privilege to have back Laurence Caruana to discuss his latest book, Sacred Codes, The Forgotten Principle of Painting. How are you doing today, Laurence?
I'm doing great. Great to hear your voice again, Miguel.
It really is great to have you back on. It's been a while, so I think we'll have a lot to catch up on and a lot to talk about. And with us to keep us company, we've got the Moondog Vance. How are you doing tonight, Vance?
I'm doing fine.
Good.
Looking forward to this.
Yes, great to have you here. So, Laurence, it's been a while since you've been on AM Byte Gnostic Radio. So for the audience, as this venture has grown gradually in the last few years, could you tell the audience a little bit about yourself?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Well, it was my pleasure to appear twice on Eon Byte so far. Back in the days when it was coffee, cigarettes, and Gnosis,
Sure.
I introduced one book which was called The Hidden Passion, and that's basically a novel that deconstructs the Gnostic myth using the Nag Hammadi library and referencing it throughout. So we talked about the Hidden Passion, and then we also talked about another book of mine, Enter Through the Image, which is more concerned about how we can contemplate on works of art and the whole image language behind works of art. I've been keeping pretty busy. I'm a painter, I'm a writer, I'm also a lecturer. And so as a painter, I'm mostly concerned with a genre of painting called visionary art. And visionary art, really, if you think of Salvador Dali and surrealism, and the way it recorded dreams, well, visionary art records visions, using classical techniques of painting to record our visions. And that's been my path for the last 40 years or so. I'm in my 50s now. And as a result, I've also come to write books about visionary art, as well as making visionary paintings. And I've also created a school which teaches visionary art. And that's located in Vienna right now because my teacher, or you could say my master in painting, was Professor Ernst Fuchs, who came from Vienna and the Viennese School of Fantastic Realism. So I'm now director of the Vienna Academy of Visionary Art. And through that place, we transmit the sacred codes of painting, you could say. We transmit all of the forgotten principles of what goes into making a painting, in behind the composition, the figure, and so on. But also, because it's visionary painting, I talk about visionary seeing. And this is really where Gnosticism kind of gets involved, because I've been passionately involved with Gnosticism for at least 20 or 30 years now. And so the types of seeing or visionary seeing that we experience in visionary art is deeply related to the description of seeing that you get in Gnosticism. So maybe we can go into that at some point in this program.
Sure. So you would say that your interest in Gnosticism sort of grew parallel with your interest in painting, and also the rest too, your interest in the Neoplatonists and the Hermetics and all that. Was it an organic thing, or were they sort of a separate interest?
No, exactly. It goes hand in hand. I'm a person who has had a variety of experiences, and when those visionary experiences occurred, I wanted to research and find out and find parallels in history where those things have occurred. And it was really, I think, beginning with the Neoplatonists, and that I became fascinated by the idea of oneness, that divinity is a oneness. And from there, I discovered Gnosticism, and Gnosticism gave me a much more Christian, mythic kind of vision of oneness, and then the experience of visionary, the visionary outlook onto the world. So it happened pretty organically, but I've now come back to those Gnostic texts through my experiences and really kind of see them as not just created texts, but actually records of their visionary experiences. And that's what makes them fascinating for me.
And we should probably focus on visionary art, because a lot of people still might not know, and that term visionary gets bandied about a lot in today's language. But visionary, it actually means you have a vision first and then you paint, because I know in one part of your book, Laurence, you talk about how your master, Ernst Fuchs, came to you one time and said, look, don't just focus on the painting, but focus on the vision.
Mm-hmm. And also that the creation of the painting is a process itself. So, yes, you can have a vision and then you can try to record that vision in paint. That's part of it. But also the painting process itself becomes an immersion into seeing, so that while we're painting, we're actually immersed in a different way of seeing. And so it becomes, you could say, a visionary experience as well. It's as much a process as anything else. It's and I would even go so far as to say sometimes it requires an initiation, because it is an altered way of seeing, an altered form of perception. And when it first kind of occurred to me, I was pretty amazed at how we can broaden our vision, change our usual perception of things. So I was, in a certain sense, initiated, although I don't make a big deal about that. It's just something that kind of happened naturally by working with my master on his paintings and being introduced to these ways of seeing.
And what would you say are some of the features of visionary art? For example, you mention in your book somebody like H.R. Geiger, which I like because many people know his art, and some have said nobody draws archons better than H.R. Geiger. And I remember scholars saying his art is not about our fall into matter, but our fall into technology, how technology and humanity get blended in together. So what makes H.R. Geiger a visionary artist, and what's maybe some of the features so the audience can know?
Mm-hmm. It's interesting that you mention him, because he's probably best known for creating the alien design.
Right.
But his work, which is these airbrushed nightmares, really capture the Gnostic spirit. What you often have in his work is a female figure, often ghostly white, and she's trapped in this horrible technological hell, which is raping her in various ways. And I think if you were a feminist, you might read it one way, but as a Gnostic, you would kind of see that image of the white female as the soul. And that is very much portraying the way the soul is trapped in this archontic world, trapped. And we ourselves are experiencing that daily pretty much through technology. And so his vision's a very dark vision, which makes it unique in visionary art, which tends to be more spiritual. But I love that aspect of his work. And visionary artists of the past, we might think of Hieronymus Bosch, or William Blake, or Gustave Moreau. And then moving into the 20th century, Ernst Fuchs, who emerged in the post-World War II period of Europe in the 1950s, was definitely what we call the godfather of visionary art. And he knew well H.R. Geiger and other artists who you might recognize. Matti Klarwein, he did the album cover of Abraxas by Santana, and that's a very visionary work of art. So Klarwein and H.R. Geiger are this older generation, Robert Venosa being another, and it's kind of spread across the planet in its most miraculous way of artists who are really doing their best to create a kind of art that, first of all, revives painting and the skills of painting, but also the visions that they're having, visions of the sacred, but also it can be visions of darkness, visions of darkness, visions of light, are emerging in their art. And we tend to see a lot of figurative work with strong colors and energy vibration and sometimes geometry and so on. It's a movement which has spread through the planet mostly through the transformational festival scene, but also through the internet. And I'm pleased to say that, for example, our academy in Vienna, we attract students from as far as Brazil or India or North America, South America, all across the world, really. And so it's become this international phenomenon. Probably the best known visionary artist today is Alex Gray, if you're familiar with his work, who did the album covers for Tool, for example, and that spread his work across the planet as well. I could give you a list of names, but those are the important ones.
Yeah, that's a great list. That's definitely a who's who's, and of course, a mutual favorite of ours that include Vance too is William Blake. I mean, he really was Gnostic. He was visionary. I like in your book how you say he was very anachronistic. That what was he thinking? Was he ahead of his times, you think? Or tell us how you feel about England's poet.
Yeah. Well, quoting a bit from Ernst Fuchs, what makes visionary art unique is that it's this underground current which is not at all linear or historical. So a visionary artist like William Blake, he seems to be ahistorical or non-historical. His work echoes the styles of so many different cultures, and even its poetic quality. He's quoting the Bible, but he also seems to be quoting scriptures from around the world. He transcends his time in so many ways that it's like history itself is linear, but the visionary sphere is eternal time. And as we know, Blake was the one who, peered through the doors of perception and cleansed the doors of perception and saw eternity in a moment. And so he has this quality of transcending the time, and by doing that, speaking to us directly in our time. I really feel like that's what makes him unique as an artist, and a huge influence on Fuchs, on myself, and on visionary art in general.
Oh, I agree. He's great. No doubt about that. And something I wanted to cover for sure is, which I found very interesting, is the idea of hieratic and humanistic art. And I think this is very important to know even within the visionary art space. Could you tell the listener a little bit about that?
Sure, I'd love to. So in the book, I do distinguish between hieratic and humanist art. Hieratic simply being a Greek word for the sacred and the sacred traditions. When you look at visionary art, we often reference other traditions. Those can be Eastern, like Buddhist or Hindu, or more tribal kind of societies, or ancient Egypt. And a lot of the sacred art tends to be very symmetrical, tends to depict deities, tend to be very still. The hand gestures are these frozen mudras, very symbolic. And so the whole hieratic tradition, in a way, uses painting to create a mirror reflection for the sacred. We ourselves here in the 21st century are coming from a tradition of painting in the West that emerged since the Renaissance. And the Renaissance, looking back to ancient Greece, this is all humanist. And humanity, the human, became the center of the main concern of art. And when you look at humanist art, which is to say classical Greece and the Renaissance onward until today, The figure tends to be very dynamic. The face is very expressive. The hands are gesturing, but what they're gesturing is the passions of the soul, that they're really giving you human expression, powerful human expression. So we are ourselves in the West kind of still at the tail end of this humanist tradition where humanity is the central focus of art. But Western art, especially with visionary art, is starting to open itself up to those other traditions where the sacred, the divinities, they were the center of what we depict in a work of art. So visionary art has this task, I say in my book, of uniting the hieratic and the humanist traditions, of creating a work of art where we still have humanity and human feeling and the passions of the soul as being depicted through the figures. But at the same time, we're trying to still the eye and create an image for contemplation. And in that sense, create an image like you would see in the Buddha, for example, or a Hindu deity or ancient Egypt, where we still the eye to a point of focus and contemplation. And that becomes a very different form of seeing. And I would argue that once you do learn to meditate or contemplate on a work of art, you begin to see it very differently. Instead of racing your eye all over the painting in search of some kind of narrative or movement, you're really entering into the work of art. An expression I used in an earlier book, which is taken directly from the Gospel of Philip, is enter through the image. And it really becomes an experience of entering through the image, not being obsessed with the surface qualities and textures of the paint, but rather the vision, the deity, the experience that awaits us on the other side of that doorway.
Yes, indeed. I think in one part, you have a great line. You say, when you're painting, you just don't see the divine, but the divine sees you.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we forget that all of works of art used to be placed in temples, and you would enter into a temple, and the purpose of entering into a temple was to be seen by the deity rather than to see the deity. And the work of art had that power of the vision of the statue was commanding, and you would surrender your gaze to the statue. This then becomes important for us as visionary artists, where we want to open our eye to divine seeing, get kind of our human ego out of the way, which tends to be very critical or negative or whatever. And really, by surrendering our sight to what's emerging as we paint, we're really trying to participate in the divine act of creation. It really is something, again, that I come back to through the Apocryphon of John, that it creates a whole new way of understanding when you think of the creative act as being this act of seeing. In the Bible, the book of Genesis, it begins, and God said, let there be light. But that's a very verbal thing, and we understand that because with our voice, we actively speak. If it was changed to, and God saw, and there was light, you would come much closer to this creative act of vision that we get in the Apocryphon of John. And this is what I mean by divine seeing, that the divine creates through vision, and we have this active form of seeing that creates the cosmos around it, particularly in the Apocryphon of John. And that's where that book really resonates me at a very deep level.
Same here, and I like what you write. Also in Sacred Codes, you say the author of the Apocryphon of John or the Secret Book of John or the community behind it, they weren't just drawing some rational map about how they thought was the mind of the divine and how he fell out, but these were based on very deep experiences, don't you think?
Absolutely. one example I can give you is how they constantly refer to the eons as a watery light. And it's a very powerful image of the watery light. So the one sees images or reflections of itself in the watery light. And definitely when we enter the visionary sphere, when we enter into the field of visions, it has that quality of this translucent kind of depths of watery light. And everything that we see becomes like an immediate reflection of our thoughts, of our feelings. I can't imagine that the people who wrote these texts were simply making it up as they went along. Rather, they were using language to the best of their ability to capture the experiences they were having when they were immersed, in meditation or contemplation or whatever, when they were immersed in this peak experience of experiencing divinity, and trying to capture that then in those words. If you don't mind, I have a little quote for you.
Sure. Yeah, I'd love to hear it. Yeah.
And it's speaking of the One, which is to say, the divine source of all things. And it says, "For it is he, the One, who looks at himself in his light which surrounds him, namely the spring of the water of life. And it is he who gazes upon his image, which he sees in the spring of the Spirit. It is he who puts his desire in his water light, which is in the spring of the pure light water which surrounds him." And then the classic moment begins that, and his thought, which is to say nous, performed a deed, and she, Enoia, came forth, she who had appeared before him as an image in the shine of his light. She came forth from his mind, nous, and this is the first thought, his image. So this whole idea of what's called the noesis, the divine one as a thinking of a thought of itself thinking. This is taken from Aristotle. But you get this image of consciousness expanding outward into the watery light. And as it does so, it is thinking. And then suddenly it reaches this moment of solidity, which is the image that takes form in the watery light, and that's the thought. So it's now thinking a thought, which we basically understand as consciousness. But the next step in the creation is thinking a thought of itself thinking, and that becomes the reflection or the self-consciousness. So this really becomes the divine Trinity in Gnosticism, the Father, the Mother, and together they create the child. And this child then eventually we realize becomes Christ, or Christ and Sophia together as this kind of asexual being. So in the Apocryphon of John, you have this kind of oneness which expands into multiplicity, and as it does so, it remains one at its source, the Trinity that is still the unity. And at the same time, it's this eye in the center of the watery light, and as the eye looks and sees, it sees reflections of itself, differing reflections of itself. And I am kind of amazed at this concept of what I call the mirrored sphere, where you have an eye in the center of this mirrored sphere, and as it looks outward, actively creating its vision, the mirrored sphere reflects back to it its first thought. And then the remainder of the creation is basically all the other things that it can create within the mirrored sphere. And that becomes, in fact, the entire cosmos, or at least the upper eons, as we say in the Gnostic tradition.
It almost seems like a hologram of sorts, right? One thought spreading out.
Exactly. And being unified at the source, though. So
exactly.
Macrobius describes it as so many mirrors, row on row, reflecting the same source of light. And it's a beautiful idea that you have these mirrors in rows upon rows upon rows, expanding outward in multiplicity, but they all reflect back this one to itself in this amazing number of different guises, as male, as female, as adult, as child, as, you know, the 4 lights, as the 12 eons, and so on. Yeah, I get shivers when I...
Oh, it's beautiful. I mean, it's wonderful poetry. It's mystic, and you can meditate on it. And you also write in your book sacred codes about how the Gnostic, when they were doing their rituals of ascent, and a couple of texts say the way of descent is the way of ascent and vice versa, but they wore these bodies of lights. What are those to you, Laurence?
Yeah, well, now we're getting into the later chapters of the book, and I start to talk about theurgy, which is a specific tradition in the West, coming from the same place as the Gnostic texts, coming from Alexandria in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, even as far as the 4th centuries AD. And the theurgists, beginning with, say, Iamblichus, who wrote on the Mysteries, or Proclus, who wrote on the Sacred Art, they were trying to describe what was going on during these mystery celebrations. And basically, the theurgists were the ones who consecrated a statue to make it sacred, and then also contemplated the statues, because in a certain sense, a sacred image only becomes sacred once it's activated. And to activate it, the divinity has to be seen. It has to become present. I said that it sees you, and that's true, but also you have to, in a certain sense, see the divinity in the statue for it to really be a sacred image. So the theurgists then, like Iamblichus and Proclus, they went to great depths to describe this process of consecrating a statue. And it went to the extent that in their meditations, they would ascend through the cosmic spheres. So if you know the Ptolemaic universe or cosmos that existed at that time, you had 7 cosmic spheres that you could see in the heavens, and they became like a spheres within spheres, a kind of hierarchy. And your soul, and we see this in Gnosticism as well, that your soul would ascend through the cosmic spheres. And so when they were doing their contemplation or their meditation, their soul would ascend through the cosmic spheres. But as we know in, say, Gnosticism, they're actually quite demonic. You know, they're trying to trap you. They're trying to capture your soul and throw it back down. So each person needed a form of protection in their journey through the cosmic spheres. In the case of the theurgists, they talked about the okema, and the okema being this kind of vehicle for their soul to protect it. It was this spherical vehicle. In the case of the Gnostics, I tend to believe that this idea of the garment of light was very much the same thing, that the Gnostics went through this ritual to put on the garment of light, and one of the functions of the garment of light was to protect them in the visionary ascent through the cosmic spheres. And we definitely see this in the Apocalypse of Paul or Zostrianos, where the figure is meditating, and as they do so, they're ascending through the heavenly spheres. And sometimes they need special words or names, sometimes they need signs or sigils, but they also need to just be in a certain state of mind where they don't feel fear. You know, the dialogue of the Savior, for example, says that if you feel fear, they will devour you. So that brings up the need protection, that the moment fear emerges, then the Archon becomes this image of fear. And it brings me back to this idea of the mirrored sphere, where you are actually in the visionary, in visions, you are actually immersed in a mirrored sphere. And the moment that you feel fear, then images of fear become are materialized and become reflected back to you, you know? And if you if you feel, let us say, desire, immediately images of desire will materialize, but then you become entrapped within those images of desire that appear in the mirrored sphere. So the visionary ascent was, in a certain sense, this form of seeing within the mirrored sphere where you are passing from one sphere, which is to say one state of the soul, to another, from fear to desire, from desire to envy, from envy to pride, from pride to, and each of these corresponded to a certain planet, to a certain archon, to a certain lower eon, you know, in the Gnostic tradition. So the Gnostics and the theurgists, they had to strip away first the body and all the accoutrements of the body. Then they had to strip away the soul, and the soul had these 7 garments, like fear and desire and pride. And once you stripped away the 7, it was actually 5 garments of the body: earth, air, fire, water, and the ether, and 7 garments of the soul, which correspond to the 7 planetary spheres. Then you could finally enter the middle, you know, into the fixed stars, and beyond that into the upper eons, which are really the reflection of the lower eons, but it's now in the stilled eternal archetypes, you know, as Plato called them, the Idae, where in the upper eons we're no longer in a place of the passions of the soul, but really of the higher states of mind or the higher states of consciousness, like memory and reflection and so on, including love and grace and so on. You know, the Apocryphon of John lists all of these as the upper eons, and they're basically forms of consciousness that the contemplator or the meditator could experience once they pass through the lower eons of their own body and their own soul reflected back to them.
Yes,
how's that?
That's great. You know, I think you hit it on the head. That is definitely, you might say, as scholars have written, this is ecstatic rituals. These are shamanistic rituals where the Gnostics purified themselves and went on these visionary flights across higher levels of consciousness. I think you definitely nailed it very well. But a question I had is this sort of visionary seeing that the Gnostics had, that the Neoplatonists had, and so forth. This actually started long before them, didn't it?
Yeah. Now we're coming into this. I mentioned humanism and the hieratic. And humanism, we are the heirs of the humanist tradition, which started at the time of the Renaissance. And one thing which started at the time of the Renaissance was the idea that vision is passive, that light kind of reflects off the object and enters into our eyes and carries with it the object that we're looking at. And I have no problem with that. I think vision can be passive. But before the Renaissance, and going back to Gnosticism, so Alexandria in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, but even further back to Plato, 300 BCE, and then the pre-Socratic philosophers, we discover that vision was understood as something active, that the eye cast forth this light from within. And it was this intraocular fire, as they called it. They referred to the eye as a lantern. And so vision was understood as active. Vision was understood as light going outward from your eyes. And in Plato's description, it then fused with the light in the surrounding air. He said, like becomes like. So it fused with the light in the surrounding air, and vision then spread outward. That's definitely the model of vision that you get in the Apocryphon of John, and in really any Greek text. I even cite Euclid in his geometry, for example, that when you read Euclid closely, he's referring to vision as this active thing where vision streams outward from the eye. I think it really helps us as humans today to consider our vision or our seeing not just as this passive act of receptivity, but to think of us as creating the cosmos around ourselves, that we're creating the reality that we're making around ourselves. And the more we kind of take responsibility for where we cast our eyes and what we do with our visions, the more that we're engaging in that older model of seeing, what was called the extramission vision, where in a certain sense, you could even open your eye and surrender it to divine vision, because the flame, the intraocular fire that you had in your eyes wasn't just human, it was divine. That it was the deities that planted the interocular fire within us and gave us the gift of vision. So we could see as the gods see, and we see thanks to the gods. Coming back to the Apocryphon of John, the deity, the one, it is consciousness and self-consciousness. Now, do we say that I'm conscious and I'm self-conscious because of my humanity? Or does our consciousness and self-consciousness, our awareness, come to us from someplace higher up? And I would argue that the moment we reflect upon that and ask ourselves, where does consciousness come from? To me, it's a gift of the divine. And we have to kind of open ourselves up to that divine gift of becoming aware. And vision, thinking, they're really the same thing. That it's really about divine consciousness or divine vision passing through us as we open our minds, as we open our eyes, to the source from whence we came.
That was well said, Laurence. And what about you, Vance? You have a question? This is really fascinating.
I know, I've been following it. I got a million questions, but I'm going to have to limit myself. Laurence, what do you think about the concept of the fact that each one of us, this is going to sound funny, is the only one? We are the monad, looking out at the world through a filter that we somehow chose. And of course, that dovetails into everything you've been saying in my mind. Just wondering what you think of that.
Yeah, philosophically, that's called solipsism. And there was a philosopher, Wittgenstein, who wrote an amazing sentence. He said, I am the world. And I think that point of view is absolutely valid, but the only problem with solipsism is that you become trapped in a certain, I would argue, egoistic kind of point of view, that depending on what you mean by the me in that statement and everything I speak is mine.
It's not, most people think that, but what I'm talking about is kind of a multi-solipsism where everybody is in that state. Yeah.
Well, the kind of vision I've had recently, I mentioned to you this idea of mirrored spheres. And so we are in the center of a mirrored sphere. Now imagine this, what's called the flower of life, where you have interpenetrating circles. But imagine this as being interpenetrating spheres. So that in a certain sense, your point is on the periphery of my sphere, and my point is on the periphery of your sphere, and we are each at the center of our own spheres. Do you see what I'm getting at?
Oh, yeah.
And then we start to have all these interpenetrating spheres, so then Miguel comes into the conversation, and we now have 3 interpenetrating spheres, a trinity of spheres. And we can start to multiply all of these interpenetrating mirrored spheres, where each person is at the center of their own sphere, and the others are on the various points on the periphery, but we're all in the same network, so to speak. We're all in the same grid of spheres.
Reminds me of the concept of Indra's net in Buddhism. Heard of that one, Laurence?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, we're all we're all connected, and there's an interpenetration between all of us, which are drops of light and reflections of each other. So that's definitely the Hindu way of doing it. And Definitely. Another question I wanted to ask you, Laurence, is that's the idea of beauty that Plotinus said. I've always read into him that it's just basically our soul calling us from the higher places. But what would you say is the Neoplatonist concept of beauty?
Yeah, it's very fascinating. First of all, you have to kind of accept Plotinus and his presumptions that he definitely sees divinity as this oneness, as this unity. And so for him then, when we gaze on a work of art, the first thing we sense is a certain beauty, and that's more on the sensual level. But as we take one step up, because he's very much into these three levels of being, Plotinus. So as we take one step up, we're now seeing not just the beauty of a work of art, but the harmony. And the harmony is the underlying kind of invisible structures that produce the effect of beauty. Now, the harmony itself, and we have harmony in music, but we also have harmony in painting, ultimately comes back to unity, that when something is harmonious, that means the multiplicity of notes resonate with each other in a certain way that's harmonious, and they have a certain oneness that makes them harmonious. And same thing with a painting, that when we see various things placed in a painting, well, if they're placed in these harmonious points, they unify and come together. So, as Plotinus says, when we look at a work of art and we feel beauty, finally we're recognizing the harmony, and higher up we're recognizing its oneness. And that oneness in the work of art awakens the oneness in ourselves. And he says we call it friend, we recognize it as friend, as not something foreign to ourselves, but as something innate and really in our deepest source of being. So his definition of beauty goes very far into this idea that beauty resides in harmony, and beauty resides finally in the oneness of the work. It's fascinating stuff.
Yeah, it is indeed. And again, a lot to meditate upon. And again, and you would say the ancient Egyptians had this idea of visionary seeing, or how did they influence us? Again, you write a lot about this in your book, which covers so much history and so many ideologies and movements.
Yeah. Well, one of my principal interests is when you enter into visionary states, you're, in a certain sense, drifting through your soul. You know, you are disembodied. You do not feel your body. You feel weightless. You feel like you're this spark of light or consciousness, as I said, in a mirrored sphere. And so what are you experiencing in that state? Well, many cultures have decided that you're actually experiencing your post-mortem existence in the visionary state. You're traveling through the cosmic spheres, but you're also traveling through the afterlife experience. Now, the Egyptians, which is a civilization that lasted a good 3,000 years and had an organized priesthood and organized artists and craftsmen to depict what the priests were then seeing in their visionary states, they were documenting or making these maps of the places after death, so that when your soul journeys after death, where does it journey to? Well, the Egyptians were mapping it all out over the course of their 3,000-year history. And so when you read the books of the dead or see them, they're actually carved onto the walls of the pharaoh's tombs. And when you stand there and try to understand this boat journey of the soul through the various gates of the underworld, you become aware that Egyptian civilization was very advanced in charting the netherworlds. Other societies like tribal societies or Buddhism as well have been doing that as well for centuries. Our Western way of looking at things, we're like beginners or juveniles, actually, when it comes to making maps of the afterworld. We're so obsessed with our present life existence and our technology and how our technology can prolong this present life that we're not quite so interested, although, it is changing, that more and more people are becoming aware of these ancient texts or Eastern texts and so on, and developing life practices based on preparation for this journey through the afterworld, basically.
Yes, they seem to be, they were almost like mapping the whole consciousness from beginning to end. And this later, would you say, really influenced the Greek mysteries, or what other features or innovations did the Greeks give us?
Yeah, absolutely. The Greek mysteries, when you read, of course, they were mysteries. No one actually wrote what they experienced. But when we come close and we look at some of the texts that were left to us by people who had experienced it, they said they felt like I put one foot on the threshold of Persephone's underworld and came away with no longer fearing death. And they no longer feared death because they had a glimpse of, what happens to the soul in the afterworld. So the mysteries were a kind of initiation to prepare you for death, and prepare you in the sense of no longer feeling that fear that naturally accompanies death, because you're now prepared for what's on the other side. And of course, that preparation could go deeper and deeper and deeper. Buddhist monks in the East, they have a whole series of meditations and so on to prepare themselves for the journey after death. In ancient Greece, it was more like a ritual, and that ritual itself kind of engraved in the memory all the different steps or places or what to say and what not to say. Should you drink from the river of Lethe? Well, the river of Lethe is the river of forgetfulness. So if you don't drink from the river of Lethe, then you will remember your past lives. And this goes back as far as the Orphic religion, which is one of the earliest Greek religions that we have, like 6th century BC. Plato definitely was then quoting the Orphics on that and saying, with recollection, that we have to unforget everything we did forget when we drank from the river of Lethe and we drank from the river of forgetfulness.
Yes, like you said, it's a big secret. The Greek mysteries, if you talk about Demeter and all those, but we get what we get. And here's something I'm curious to ask you, Laurence. I mean, the Gnostics, the Neoplatonists, the Hermetics. You can say the Hermetics are pagan Gnostics, and the Orphics later on, the Kabbalists and all that were, you might say, this one divine mind emanationist theology. What separates the Gnostics was their introduction of the archons, this sort of separate ontological evil or oppression. Do you ever have a problem with that? How it's different and how it can be kind of edgy, like the work of H.R. Geiger?
Exactly. Yeah, I've had people question me on that.
Me too, all the time.
When you look up at the sun, do you actually see Yalta-Bao of this lion-headed serpent staring back at you, or do you see the sun in this more positive light, right? And I just remind myself that here I am with mirrors again, but it's a mirrored cosmos, that the lower eons are modeled on the upper eons. And so for every negative interpretation that we have, if I look on the sun or Venus or Mars and see the archon staring back at me, that really there's this upper eon cosmos where the sun and Venus and Mars also exist in the upper eons as those divine archetypes. You see what I'm getting at?
Oh, yeah.
So I kind of love Gnosticism for that reason, that it gives us the darkness as well as the light and doesn't just say, hey, look, it's all light. That the more we see the darkness and understand the darkness, we're getting into Jung here and the unconscious, but the more we become aware of these forces of darkness that are acting through us, I think that's where the Gnostics are absolutely unique and powerful and meaningful for the times that we're living in. And I would go on to say that we're actually living in darkened times where, with the conspiracy theories and so on that we have, Gnosticism resonates so much more strongly today than it did, say, during the Renaissance, which was kind of a Neoplatonic period of history. Everyone was looking at the light, whereas now we can gaze into the darkness and see what's staring back at us, and that seems to be this Gnostic cosmos that we're describing.
Yes, a lot of shadows coming out, and it's interesting when you talk about the mirrored sphere and the one reflecting itself. The scholar Einar Thomason, he makes a good argument that all the archons are not separate. They're all an aspect of Yaldabaoth. They're all just a reflection of Yaldabaoth. So you have these two, the one mind and Yaldabaoth at the bottom, and that's it.
Well, that's where the anthropos comes in, that there are these, in a lot of Gnostic texts, there are 3 levels or forms of the anthropos. And so you have this pneumatic or spiritual anthropos, which is the divine image of man in all its perfection. And then you have the soulful or psychic anthropos, which is created by Yaldabaoth and his archons, and becomes the demonic image of man in all its kind of evil machinations. And then finally there's that third anthropos, the hylic or material anthropos, which is our material humanity created from earth, air, fire, and water, but this base matter that you get in alchemy, the prima materia. And so we as human beings, we have to acknowledge ourselves, as the higher, the higher man, the upper anthropos, the spiritual anthropos. But at the same time, we have within our very makeup, this psychic anthropos, which surrenders itself to all the machinations of evil that are controlling it from above through the planets and so on, as well as our actual physical existence. So I love Gnosticism for that reason, that it gives us this model in which to situate ourselves in the cosmos. It's hermetic in that sense of as above, so below. That we have cosmos in us, and the outer cosmos, the planets and so on, are influencing us all the time. Now, I want to come back to that idea that it's not just the archons who are influencing us, but also the upper aeonic angelic beings. They're also there, and we can call upon them or reflect them in our souls. This twinship and, again, mirroring that goes on in Gnosticism. They love the image of the mirror. They use it all the time. And, does your vision seek out and see mirror images of the lower eons, of the demons, or does it see mirror images of the angels in the upper eons? It all depends on where you are in your soul at that moment, right? And where you turn your gaze, basically.
Also interesting, and let me know your thoughts on this, Laurence, but you talk about visionary art, and we talked about artists from Blake to Geiger to Alex Gray, and it seems deconstruction seems to be a great feature of visionary art. If there's something the Gnostics did, is they were deconstructing everything around them, and that annoyed other movements like the Jews and the Neoplatonists and the Christians. So do you find it another great feature of the Gnostics, how they just tore everything apart to really weave into their visions?
I think that's actually a quality of an epiphany, that when you have a revelation, when you have a genuine experience of awe and wonder of the divine, you then seek out any and all images, words, traditions that will authentically describe or replicate that experience. So the Gnostics, who were living in Alexandria, which was this melting pot of Christian, Jewish, ancient, I say Egyptian, but the almost forgotten Egyptian traditions, as well as the Greek and Roman, they had these genuine visionary experiences or mystical experiences, and they just used whatever was at hand to describe it. So that's where you see in the texts all this blending of all the different things. And like you said, not just blending, but subverting, turning things on their head, so that the story of the tree of knowledge in the Garden of Eden, that whole story gets turned on its head. And I love Gnosticism for that, because it's subversive, but at the same time it's creative. They don't fall into orthodoxy at all. They don't treat the word or the image as so sacred and inviolate that all we can do is transmit it without altering it, and so visionary art also has that quality insofar as, for example, in my work, I will blend Christ with an image of Vishnu from the Hindu tradition or Horus from the Egyptian tradition. And Christ is not this image that, for an Orthodox Christian, that would be sacrilege. That would be heresy. And, we all love fundamentally, we love being the heretics. We love being the outsiders. We love being the provocateur, if you want. That force people to think a little bit, that forces them to view something from a different angle. And that's what I started as a Christian, and what Gnosticism did for me was allow me to escape the narrow confines of my Christian prison and then see Christianity from this much broader point of view. And I'm forever grateful for Gnosticism for doing that to me without destroying the Christianity. They were so deeply immersed in their, and I don't want to say faith, but immersed in their awareness of divinity and its presence in their lives, that there's an authenticity to all of their writings that doesn't make it just a kind of a forced play. It's actually, they're breaking things apart and reusing them, but they're doing it for this deeper purpose, and that's the genuine mystical experience at the core of everything they do. And that's the Gnosis, of course.
That's some great Gnosis you have there, Laurence. And, well, I think that's all the time we have today, Laurence. I'd like to thank you very much for coming on Aeon Byte and discussing your wonderful book, Sacred Codes, The Forgotten Principles of Painting, Volume 1. And,
Miguel, let me take a moment to just say, from the depths of my heart, thank you for all the amazing work that you've been doing for the Gnostic community. You are really one of the guiding lights in our whole community here, and what you've done is incredible. And I really admire your outlook. That if there was any one person I would find to guide us through the language of Gnosticism, is definitely you. So you are a guiding spirit. Thank you so much for everything that you've done.
Oh, thank you. But I'm just a reflection of you and Vance and everybody, all of us seekers. We're all just here in our sphere of light, or mirrored sphere, doing the best we can. So we'll get there. We'll get to the top. But thank you so much, Laurence. I always enjoy having you on. It's an honor and a privilege.
Well, I hope to talk to you again very soon then.
And there you have it, our first part of our interview with Laurence Caruana on his latest greatest work, Sacred Codes. Love me that Laurence and his heresy. In our second part, Laurence goes deep into the issue of using psychedelics to optimize the creation of art or just mind expansion. He discusses meditation also in relation to any creation or invention, including the concept of mandalas. This all involves sharing his personal rituals and experiences within theurgens and meditation, and the supernatural experiences he's had in his quest for Gnosis. Furthermore, Laurence will share his ideas on the flight of the soul through the various dimensions, as well as grant advice for those of you wanting to try some of your own visionary art or visionary seeing. Very hands-on stuff. As mentioned, for members, I've included Laurence's interview on his book, Enter Through the Image, where he deals with many of the same themes, but with a bit more focus on the visual seeing of Hinduism, Buddhism, and other Eastern mysticism. and he focuses on Gnostic texts that we didn't include that much in this interview, like the Gospel of Philip and more. So please become a member to access all this heresy and all our past shows. Just go to the godabovegod.com and scroll halfway down for ways to become a member or patron at Patreon. Or just check out our show notes. I can't do this without you, and only your support keeps this Red Pill Cafeteria open. We've only just begun, and Jehovah and his angelic mafia are ramping up the cosmic ignorance and the death of creativity in this post-truth, fake news, and alternative fact days. Thanks for being here, and thanks for being yourself. And hopefully you can become the best version of yourself if you leverage more art and creativity and invention in your existence. I know you can, and I know you're remarkable. Hello and goodbye as always.